Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
You're listening to WRUULP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. Thank you. We're getting ready to start the One Human Nation show. And before we get started, I do want to make sure that we get this disclaimer out there that the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. If you're like me, it's been another week of turmoil with our election process, and in Georgia we're still counting votes. So I thought this show would be good because we've been kind of focusing on voter suppression, which we're going to touch base on towards the end of the show. But I thought it would be a good walk down history lane to find out more about this two-party system that we're in. Because if you've listened before, you know, my one of my big concerns is that it's very difficult to have civil conversations now. Everybody's in their silo. I see things blasted back and forth on Facebook, and that's not going to resolve anything, I don't think, productive-wise anyway. And the purpose of the One Human Nation show is that we can have open, honest dialogue so that we can be productive. And we can't do that if we don't even know the truth of our history. So it was very interesting. I was able to find a couple of clips, and it was from this person. I'll just be upfront. Her name is Carol Swain, and she has a conservative perspective. And I want to say that because I want us to open our minds to all conversations so we can be informed. And so one of the things in researching, you know, where and who was hosting this, it's hosted by an institution which is a nonprofit organization, an American nonprofit organization that goes by PragerU, Prager, PragerU, and some of you may have seen this, short for Prager University. And so what this organization does, it creates videos on various political, economic, and philosophical topics from a conservative or right-wing perspective. And so these videos, and those of you that know me, you can find them on YouTube. But what was interesting about this is I found someone that was also giving an alternative viewpoint on what Carol Swain is talking about. In her initial videos are entitled The Inconvenient Truth About the Republican Party, The Inconvenient Truth About the Conservative Party, about the Democratic Party, based on a conservative point of view. And then we have this person that's debunking this, and his name is Marcus. I don't have a last name just other than Marcus on Twitter. And so I thought it was interesting if we just take a listen and go back down memory lane and really take a deep dive into how we are now at this, two-party system. Where did it start? Where did it come from? Who's who? And so we're going to take a listen to that and see if we can get more knowledge and information and truth about our political party system here in this country.
Racist, sexist, Republican, these words are virtually interchangeable, at least according to most professors, journalists, and celebrities. So are they right?
The video we're about to watch is PragerU denying the ideological switch between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The switch was slow and took time, but most importantly, it happened. All right, let's take a look at this video.
Let's take a look at history. The Republican Party was created in 1854. The first Republican Party platform adopted at the party's first national convention in 1856, promised to defeat, quote, those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery. Those twin relics were spreading into the Western territories. Republicans feared that as those territories became states, polygamy and slavery might become permanent parts of American life. Polygamy, the marriage of one man to multiple women, devalued women and made them a kind of property. Slavery, of course, did the same to blacks, literally.
The Republican Party was formed by members of the Whig Party and Democratic Party. The Whig Party was formed in opposition to Democrats and their president, Andrew Jackson. Which party likes Andrew Jackson nowadays? The Whigs were protectionists who supported tariffs while wanting the federal government to finance, quote, internal improvements. They also believed in federal banking, attempting to recreate the Bank of the U.S., which had been abolished by President Andrew Jackson. This differed from the Democratic Party, who back then was the party of states' rights. The Republican Party was formed by anti-slavery expansionists and slavery abolitionists of the Whig Party and some Northern Democrats. Abraham Lincoln was a member of the Whig Party before becoming a Republican. In 1855, while considering a possible switch to the Republican Party, he said, quote, I think I am a Whig, but others say there are no Whigs and that I am an abolitionist. I do no more than oppose the extension of slavery, unquote. So the original GOP, the original Republican Party, was a coalition of anti-slavery expansionist Whigs and Northern Democrats and abolitionist Whigs.
The Democrats were so opposed to the Republicans and their anti-slavery stance that in 1860, just 6 weeks after the election of the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, South Carolina, a state dominated by Democrats, voted to secede from the Union. The Civil War that followed was the bloodiest war in U.S. history.
South Carolina was dominated by Southern Democrats. This is an important distinction that PragerU leaves out because Northern Democrats did not support the Confederacy at all. The Democratic Party had become split over the idea of the expansion of slavery in the mid-1800s. You had Northern Democrats, many of whom were anti-slavery expansionists, not necessarily anti-slavery, and Southern Democrats, who were pro-slavery hardliners. They wanted to expand it all the way to California. This is shown in the 1860 presidential election, where the Democratic Party had two presidential candidates. The hardline, pro-slavery Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge broke away from the Democratic Party, running an independent campaign because the Democratic Party's nominee was Senator Stephen Douglas, a Northern Democrat who was more 50-50 on slavery, daring to believe that new states such as Kansas and Nebraska should be able to vote on whether to allow slavery or not. Douglas, the Democratic Party's nominee, was a staunch ally of the Union and rallied the party to completely support it as well. PragerU purposefully leaves this out, collectivizing the Democratic Party as all being for the Confederacy because it doesn't fit their narrative.
It led to the passage by Republicans of the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves, the 14th Amendment, which gave them citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which gave them the vote. In 1870, the first black senator and the first black congressman were sworn in, both Republicans. In fact, every black representative in the House until 1935 was a Republican, and every black senator until 1979 was too. For that matter, the first female member of Congress was a Republican. The first Hispanic governor and senator were Republicans. The first Asian senator, you get the idea.
Things changed a lot after 1935, though. Let's take a look at the House. There have been 28 black Republicans in the House and 117 black Democrats. Before 1935, all 6 black congressmen that had served were Republicans. And while they might not have supported every Republican Party policy, many of them were former slaves and looked at Lincoln and the GOP as the bringers of their freedom. Rightfully so. However, this started to change in 1929 with the stock market crash, with blacks who lived in northern states deciding to join the Northern Democrats. This led to many ultimately serving as Northern Democrats in the House. Again, it's very important to point out the North-South divide in the Democratic Party. It wasn't until 1973 when Andrew Young, a Northern Democrat ideologically, but not physically, who was black, was elected to represent the deep South state of Georgia in the House. Until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Democratic Party held together a very strange coalition. FDR was elected 4 times, getting the conservative, racist, white Southern vote, and the liberal Democrat vote in the North. While FDR didn't get a majority of black voters to vote for him in 1932, his first term as president, this changed as the success of the New Deal started bringing more black voters into the Democratic Party. FDR didn't push to end Jim Crow and segregation, as that would have alienated the important white Southern Democratic vote. This is when the Democratic Party started shifting more towards civil rights, and the divide between Northern and Southern Democrats was growing by the year.
Republicans also kept their pledge to defend women's rights. In 1862, the Maria.
We're going to pause right here for a minute. If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation Show, and I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. So we're taking a deeper dive and looking at the history of how the Republican Party evolved and how the Democratic Party evolved. And so one of the things that struck me as I was doing some research on this for the show is that it did not become politically correct to really support civil rights that really kind of were getting more play in the 1930s once the stock market was crashing. It didn't really become politically correct until like the 1950s, specifically 1948 campaign from Harry Truman. And so one of the reasons for this is that they did not want to alienate what was referred to as the Dixiecrats. So if you want to do a little deeper dive into that, the Dixiecrats were a political party organized in the summer of 1948 by conservative white Southern Democrats committed to states' rights and the maintenance of segregation and opposed to federal intervention into race and to a lesser degree labor relations. So as we continue to listen to these two opposing viewpoints, one coming from the conservative side, from Carol Swain, and she's a political science professor and of law at Vanderbilt University, if this information that I'm looking at is correct. And then the other male voice that you hear is from someone that's referred to as Marcus, and he's on Twitter. I don't have his last name, and if you look up these two, if you look up this video on YouTube, it's entitled Debunking or Debunked PragerU, the Inconvenience of the Republican Party. So in other words, so you'll hear a female voice and a male voice if you're just tuning in. So we're going to continue to listen to this as we take a deeper dive into looking at our political party history.
A real anti-bigamy act was passed by the Republican-controlled Congress to put an end to polygamy. In 1920, after 52 years of Democratic Party opposition, the 19th Amendment was ratified thanks to the Republican Congress, which pressured Democratic President Woodrow Wilson to drop his opposition to women's rights. In the final tally, only 59% of House Democrats and 41% of Senate Democrats supported women's suffrage. That's compared to 91% of House Republicans and 82% of Senate Republicans.
This is true, but misleading. Southern Democrats were staunchly against women's suffrage, while Northern Democrats were uninterested in the political risks involved. The beginnings of the 19th Amendment began during the 1912 elections, and this shows you a lot about how the Republican Party was at that point ideologically. And in these elections, the pro-suffrage Progressive Party and Socialist Party garnered a combined 33.4% of the popular vote. Former Republican President Teddy Roosevelt ran a third-party campaign in 1912 because of his dislike of William Taft, and that was the Progressive Party. He gained 27% of the popular vote. PragerU won't put this fact in their video, that there was a huge faction of the Republican Party at that time that were progressives, left-wing progressives. William Taft, the Republican candidate, gained 23% of the vote. This split the Republican vote, thereby handing Woodrow Wilson the victory. The Republican Party of the early 20th century looked a lot like the present-day Democratic Party. You had left-wing progressives like Teddy Roosevelt, who compare to our current-day Bernie Sanders, both call themselves progressives, and you had pro-business centrists who at the time were socially liberal, like William Taft, and they compare, of course, to Hillary Clinton, Cory Booker, and other establishment Democrats.
There certainly was a war on women, and it was led by the Democratic Party. But while Republicans had won a major battle for women's rights, the fight for black civil rights had a long way to go. In the 1920s, Republican President Calvin Coolidge declared that the rights of blacks are just as sacred as those of any other citizen. By contrast, when famed sprinter Jesse Owens, a staunch Republican, won 4 gold medals at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, he was snubbed by Democratic President Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt only invited white Olympians to the White House.
FDR made this unhonorable and racist decision regarding Jesse Owens to hold together the fragile Democratic coalition that saw the Democrats dominate for over 10 years. These 10 years of domination brought the New Deal, which began the exodus of blacks from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party because of how these social democratic policies benefited poor black communities. However, Jesse Owens was a staunch Republican for good reason. But this is no excuse to deny the fact that the two parties switched platforms, and that Jesse Owens was of the last generation where more black Americans belonged to the Republican Party than to the Democratic Party.
2 decades later, it was a Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, who sent the 101st Airborne Division to escort black students into Little Rock Central High when Arkansas Governor Orville Forbes, a Democrat, refused to honor a court order to integrate the state's public schools. The Civil Rights Act of 1960, which outlawed poll taxes and other racist measures meant to keep blacks from voting, was filibustered by 18 Democrats for 125 hours. Not one Republican senator opposed the bill. Its follow-up bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is one of the landmark pieces of legislation in American history. That, too, survived a filibuster by Democrats thanks to overwhelming Republican support.
This is the most disingenuous part. When Democratic President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, he said, quote, "We, as in the Democrats, have lost the South for a generation," unquote. And he was right. 0 Southern Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, with 10 opposing the bill. But 8 Southern Democrats supported the Civil Rights Bill, while 107 opposed it. On the other hand, 190 Northern Democrats voted for it. PragerU conveniently leaves out this vital information. After its passage, Southern Democrats began to be replaced by Republicans, even if they had opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There are many examples of this. Southern Democratic Senator George Smathers of Florida wasn't replaced in 1969 by a Democrat, but rather by Edward Gurney, a Republican. Many of Gurney's voters were supporters of Alabama Governor George Wallace, the famous Southern Democratic racist. As a congressman, Gurney voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There's more. Southern Democratic Senator Benjamin Jordan was replaced by Republican Jesse Helms in 1972. Jesse Helms staunchly opposed civil rights of any kind. Southern Democratic Senator James Eastland was re-elected after 1964, but was replaced by Republican Thad Cochran in 1978. And the biggest one and most well-known one here is Southern Democrat Strom Thurmond, a senator from South Carolina, became a Republican after he voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Thurmond remained in office after he became a Republican, continuing to oppose civil rights legislation, being elected to office by the people of former Democratic stronghold South Carolina until his Senate career ended in 2003. This was the Southern strategy, turning former Southern Democratic strongholds like South Carolina into deep red states by appealing to their racist, segregationalist nature. Democrat Lyndon Johnson's opponent in the 1964 presidential election was Republican Barry Goldwater, who had been an ardent opponent of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, believing it was an overreach of federal power. Goldwater lost the 1964 election in a landslide, but won the Deep South by a huge margin. How does PragerU not include this? Because it doesn't fit their narrative. Kevin Phillips, Richard Nixon's political strategist, said this about the GOP's strategy to gain white Southern voters. Quote, "From now on, the Republicans are never going to get more than 10 to 20% of the Negro vote, and they don't need any more of that. But Republicans would be short-sighted if they weakened enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the more the Negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That's where the votes are. Without that prodding from the blacks, the whites will backslide into their old comfortable arrangement with the local Democrats." Unquote. After anti-civil rights Goldwater was the GOP's nominee, blacks started joining the Democratic Party in large numbers. I wonder why, with people like Strom Thurmond switching to what they thought was a pro-civil rights Republican Party. This only made Southern Democrats more angry. The trend of white Southerners refusing to vote for the Democratic Party continued. In 1968, Alabama governor and former Southern Democrat George Wallace, an ardent pro-segregationalist and Jim Crow supporter, made a third-party run as a Dixiecrat, winning the South by huge margins. And in 1972, Richard Nixon won the South by huge margins. The Republican Party's Southern strategy had been a massive success. It was at this point that many blacks in the South became staunch Democrats. Democrat Andrew Young was then elected to represent Georgia's 5th District in 1973, becoming the first black Democratic congressman in a Deep South state. Many more have followed him.
But you might be thinking, all that's in the past. What have Republicans done for women and blacks lately? The answer you'd hear from professors, journalists, and celebrities is not much. And this time they'd be right. They'd be right because the Republican Party treats blacks and women as it treats everyone, as equals. The Democratic Party never has, and it still doesn't. Today's Democrats treat blacks and women as victims who aren't capable of succeeding on their own. The truth is, this is just a new kind of contempt. So there is a party with a long history of racism and sexism, but it ain't the Republicans.
It's time for PragerU to stop whitewashing history so that their group, the right-wing conservatives, look perfect. Do they really believe that the South was at one point full of big government, racist, left-wing Democrats, and as the South became less racist, the Republican Party grew? I say no. This ignores the facts. Facts trump ideology. Just like fascism isn't left-wing, but in fact right-wing. Just like the alt-right isn't left-wing, but right-wing. Just like Hitler was a right-winger and not a left-winger. Segregation might be illegal, but it's still prevalent in the United States. How could things really change in South Carolina, for example, if an anti-civil rights guy like Strom Thurmond served as its senator as late as 2003? The truth is, the Republican Party became the party that peddles the anti-civil rights, pro-segregationalist line after the Democrats passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They did this to grow and take power in the South after seeing men like George Wallace begin to hate their own party, the Democrats. The party switched platforms. The party currently headed by Trump is nowhere near being the party that was originally headed by Abraham Lincoln.
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and we've been taking a deep dive into getting the history of how we have this ideology difference between people that view themselves as Republicans, people that view themselves as Democrats. My concern with all of this is, or left wing or right wing, is that we really have to have civil discourse. And when you peg someone as being different in what you believe, if you're not open to what they have to say, then I think that's a huge problem for this country. My stance is we cannot get to reconciliation and healing about our past, not only as it relates to slavery, but as it relates to Native Americans, indigenous people. We can't get there if we can't even have a civil discourse and have conversations and be willing to learn or listen to different points of view. And I think there's a fear factor in that. I think there's a fear factor on both sides that says, well, if I change my point of view, that makes me what? And that's not what this is about. This is about being open to different points of view. But in order to be open, I do think it's important that we know our history. And I think that's where in many instances, the history books that are taught to our youth need to be corrected, because unfortunately they're learning incorrect history. And the problem happens when they get out into the real world and discover, wait a minute, this is not what they taught me in history books. So what then starts happening is this distrust. Distrust in the system, distrust in it just snowballs. And so, yes, we do have some systemic issues in this country when you look at our public school system and law enforcement and our medical system. Just about every, there's like 6 or 7 systems we can take a look at and realize that a lot of it is based on our bias and prejudice that we have. And, it's referred to with many that study in this field as unconscious bias, where we don't even realize that we're carrying this unconscious bias. And if we are in positions that are making decisions that impact people's lives that are considered the other people, and we have no idea of where they're coming from or what they have to deal with, and that's not to make excuses. That means that, okay, if you're going to raise the bar, let's make sure it's fair. In fair meaning equitable, that there's equality in the system. So what we're going to do right now is take a short break to make some announcements, and we'll be back with the One Human Nation show.
Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
The open enrollment period under the Affordable Care Act will begin on November 1st and end on December 15th. If you need help enrolling, Insure Georgia is a nonprofit, vendor, and politically neutral assistance program with telephone, online, and in-person navigators available to help. Open enrollment events will be held in Chatham County. Telephone navigators are available at 1-866-988-8246. Online navigators and more information is available at insurega.org.
WRUU is seeking to connect business and organizational partners with our diverse and passionate listeners. If you appreciate our local radio station and have the enthusiasm to cultivate sponsorship from business and organizational leaders, we have a commission-based position that might be right for you. We're looking for a non-commercial underwriting representative to take WRUU's message into the community to further support Savannah's only community radio station. For more information, or if your business would like to support us right now, email fundraising@wruu.org. And if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and so we've been doing a deep dive into our political parties. And I would be remiss in not bringing, some of the turmoil that's still occurring in Georgia. Not to say that Georgia is the only state that's still counting votes, but I'm anticipating that at some time next week that everything will be tallied. But what I wanted to bring your attention to before we take a little different look or continue looking at what role mainstream media plays in this whole divide that we're seeing in this country, I do want to bring your attention to, if you hadn't seen it, in reference to this black female senator, Nikema Williams, who is out of Atlanta. She's a Democrat, and she was protesting at the Georgia State Capitol on Tuesday afternoon at a demonstration asking the state to count every vote from last week's gubernatorial election. And so as protesters were shouting, "Let her go," she was handcuffed while the General Assembly was in session. So Williams, a civil rights advocate who organized domestic workers for Democratic gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, was charged with misdemeanor, obstruction of justice, and spent about 6 hours at Fulton County Jail in Atlanta. So there is also the policy in place that someone serving in her capacity should not be arrested for representing her constituents. And so there is a response from someone else that was in attendance, and I'm looking through my notes so I can get to it. And this was a white male that said, he was being treated differently than she was being treated. And that's what gets me back to this whole conversation of racism in this country. And so what he goes on to say, in his last name is Dreyer, Dreyer. What he goes on to say is, because of our system, because of the bias in the way that our laws are enforced, just like I went down with Senator Williams to try to de-escalate the situation, Senator Williams was taken away. We understand, and this was, of course, as of we understand she's been left in a van for a very long time on a cold and rainy day. And then he added, for some reason, I saw Capitol Police lined up 3 abreast, row after row after row, looking like they were trying to stop a riot when we were standing up for people's right to vote. So this is not democracy, and this is his comments. This looks a lot more like an authoritarian government, and it seems like that's happening a lot these days. And so we have to have transparency in order to have people trust the system. And unfortunately, we seem to be in this continued pattern of things happening where it's obvious that the system is flawed. It needs to be fixed. That in no means justify someone saying, well, that's the reason I didn't vote because, my vote doesn't matter. I can understand that point of view, but at the end of the day, it's the only system we have, and we have to utilize it and vote, because we have to get to the point of realizing that the votes do matter. And it may take us, 2-3 weeks to count the votes. If it's a close race, I have no idea. It seems like we can do better with our polling systems. And I did read locally. There was a community called Pooler, and one of the polling people that worked there, he was saying that in all of his years of working and taking it, getting people into the lines and getting them to the booths. He'd never seen anything like he saw in Pooler, and they requested more than one voting machine. They only had one. People were standing in line for 3 to 4 hours, and most people can't stand in line that long, because even though the employer may have given them the time off to vote, they and I think it's Georgia, the employer doesn't have to pay them for that time that they're out. And I think that's correct, but I'd have to look through my notes, and I don't want to spend time doing that, because I notice as time is moving along, and there's some more things we want to that I want to flesh through on this particular show, just to kind of give us a perspective of why we're so divided in this country. And as a finish up onto that story of the poll worker that was in Pooler, he's actually going to take it to the Georgia Board of Elections and voice his complaints there, because not only did they not get extra polling booths, they had asked for a copier so they could make copies of the sample ballots so people could look at those before they actually got to the booth, where things wouldn't take so long. But so it's, I don't know who said, lipstick on a pig is still a pig. So we have to do better. People have to have trust in the system. And to me, the only way you have trust in the system is that you have transparency. And it's obvious, and I'm not going to get into the deep dive of why we're at this point. You can Google it, or if you're on Facebook, there's plenty of information out there. My whole point is we really have to do a better job with this particular political system, because we have more elections coming up, and specifically locally for Savannah, November of 2019, and who knows, there may be a runoff election in Georgia also. We just, we'll see. And to me, at the end of the day, people need to feel like their votes have been counted. And there's distrust in the system right now, because between voter suppression and names being, taken off the voter roll, or however it's all happening, at the end of the day, it's still voter suppression. And we have to do better than that if we want to have a society that people feel like their vote is counted. And so one of the contributions, I think, to this divide that we're experiencing in this country is, how mainstream media plays a role in this, and what's changed in journalism compared to what it was, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So we're going to take a listen to this particular clip that talks about why we no longer have trust in the mainstream media. So let's take a listen to this and see if we can gain some additional insight as we continue on this journey of figuring out how we get through reconciliation and healing in order to become one human nation in this country.
Trust in the media is at an all-time low, and for good reason. We in the business of journalism have exempted ourselves from the normal rules that used to govern us, and so the most egregious kinds of reporting errors are becoming more common. Formerly well-respected news organizations and experienced national reporters are making the sorts of mistakes that wouldn't be tolerated in journalism school. When these mistakes are corrected at all, it's with seemingly little regret. And the corrections never get anywhere near as much attention as the original salacious but incorrect narrative. How do we get here? I discuss that in detail in my book, The Smear. Here are 3 factors. First, firewalls that once strictly separated news from opinion have been replaced by hopelessly blurred lines. Once forbidden practices such as editorializing within straight news reports and the inclusion of opinions as if fact are not only tolerated, they're encouraged. The result, it's never been harder for Americans to separate news that's real from news that's not. Example, May 14, 2016, 10 days after Donald Trump became the Republican presidential nominee, the New York Times published a blockbuster article titled "Crossing the Line: How Donald Trump Behaved with Women in Private." The story's authors, Michael Barbaro and Megan Twohey, interviewed Roanne Lane, an ex-girlfriend of Trump's. Her quotes made Trump sound at best like a jerk and at worst like a predator. The reporters went so far as to provide their own quotes for the story, presenting their personal commentary as if it were established fact, writing, "This is the public treatment of some women by Mr. Trump. Degrading, impersonal, performed." The problem is the reporting wasn't true, according to Trump's supposed victim. Once the story was published, she publicly accused the Times of misleading her, writing a hit piece against Trump, and putting a negative connotation on what she said was not a negative experience. No matter where you stand, this was a huge development in terms of journalism. The main source behind front-page national news discredited the entire premise of the story. You'd expect something like that to rock the whole news organization and prompt investigations, a retraction, and re-examination of policies. Yet I can find no record of any of that. The Times and their reporters never even apologized or printed a correction. Second, though we may personally like or dislike a politician, as journalists we're obligated to treat them the same. Too often, that's not the case. For example, in May 2008, then presidential candidate Barack Obama said he had visited 57 states. Since there are only 50 states, everyone knew what he meant. He meant to say that he had visited 47 states. The remark, nothing more than a verbal gaffe, drew little attention, and it didn't deserve more. But when Sarah Palin made a comparable gaffe saying, "We've got to stand with our North Korean allies," she was relentlessly ridiculed and mocked in the media, even though everyone knew she meant to say South Korean allies. Third, too many of us have allowed ourselves to become tools of politicians and spinmeisters, often in order to get something in return. I call this transactional journalism. Example, emails show in July 2009, the Atlantic reporter Mark Ambinder was promised a scoop. He'd get an advanced copy of a speech by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, but only if he followed certain conditions, as privately dictated by Clinton aide Philippe Rines. Rines emailed Ambinder precise instructions, including, "Describe Clinton's voice as muscular," and "Don't say you were blackmailed," by which Clinton aide Rines obviously meant, "Don't reveal our arrangement." "Got it," replied Ambinder. His resulting article reads in part, "When you think of President Obama's foreign policy, think of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. That's the message behind a muscular speech that Clinton is set to deliver today." That Ambinder, then considered a serious journalist, would allegedly violate basic ethics for such a minor story speaks volumes about the state of today's news media. For the record, Ambinder defended himself by saying that he found Clinton's speech to be muscular, so the adjective was appropriate. I think most Americans would like to believe their news is factual, well-researched, and untainted by a reporter's opinion. To put it another way, they want their news straight up. But too often now, that's not what they're getting, and they know it. I'm frequently asked, can the news be fixed? The answer is yes. But the first step to fixing a problem is admitting that we have one. Until we do that, nothing can change. I'm Cheryl Atkinson for Prager University.
Hey, have you been enjoying our videos? Did you know you can access many more like it on all sorts of interesting topics? Subscribe here to be notified whenever we post a new video.
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. So on today's show, we've talked about and learned about, hopefully, a variety of topics focused on our political system and some of the history of our political parties that people just seem to be so entrenched in their silos and without, I think, knowing some of the history. So hopefully that sheds some light in having some open dialogue with people that may not have the same opinion that you do about whichever political party you may feel that you're affiliated with. And I can be honest with you, the more people I talk to about this topic, a lot of them identify as independents. And that's very interesting because I think, we all want to vote for that person we feel like is going to be the best person to represent how we feel about certain topics, but also what's going to be best for your community, what's going to be best for the state, what's going to be best for the country. And that's where we have this divide that seems to be happening. But I believe that as we get into some of the holidays coming up, you have to start with, and I'll tell you to be very cautious about this because you don't want to start World War III with your family, but I do believe the way this starts is with the people that are closest to you. And it may be family, it may be friends, and it may be time to have that dialogue around the Thanksgiving dinner table, or, whenever you have your Thanksgiving get-together, or it may not be. It may just create a bigger divide. And so only you can determine that. And in order for that to be productive, you have to be informed about what you're talking about, and you have to be ready to engage in what's referred to as active listening. In other words, you're not listening and just, stopping talking so that then it's going to be your turn to talk, and you haven't really listened to what the person was trying to convey. And it will become very apparent that you weren't listening to what they had to convey because you immediately will start into your point of view. And I have found that it's very difficult to engage in active listening when you are so emotionally engaged in a topic. So if you need to take a step back and take this time coming up through the holidays, which typically is a slower pace for everybody, take this time to rest and rejuvenate and to learn and go back to and listen to some of the One Human Nation shows if that helps you. By this time, I've hoped you have tuned into our, subscribe to our podcast. And so that it's easy if you miss a show that you can get caught up. I think there's good content, good information that for me is helpful for me to absorb. Even if it's something I think I know, it's always good to revisit the topic. Repetition doesn't hurt. And it's amazing that as I listen to some of the clips that I play on the show, I get a different perspective pretty much every time I listen, because our minds are still kind of focusing and putting things into where we feel comfortable. So there's one other topic that I want to touch base on, and it's going to refer you back to the previous show, which aired on November 8th, and it was on this topic of tribalism. And so the guest speaker that the clips that I pulled from Amy Chua, Chua, was talking about tribalism and what this means in America, in other parts of the world. And there's a part of me that says, that thinks America's problem isn't tribalism, it's racism. And there's an actual article that another person shares my opinion on this, and his name is Adam Serwer, Serwer. He published this on November 7, 2018. And it talks about how it's easier to talk about tribalism as opposed to talking about racism. And tribalism and racism is not the same thing. And until we address the issue of racism, I don't believe we're going to get to reconciliation and healing. And so other things that are thrown out there, and I get it, people write books and, nobody wants to be identified as, oh, here we go with the race card again. But we have to really revisit our history. And you have to be very careful of how you respond to things on Facebook. I saw someone that posted that, we're all immigrants. and this was in reference to a conversation he was having in his group on Facebook. And I didn't respond to it, but my thoughts were, well, not all of us are immigrants, So immigrants came here voluntarily, even though they were being forced out of wherever they were coming from for whatever reason, whether it was economics or whether it was due to, escaping the Nazism, whatever the reason was, it was a voluntary choice, even though they may not have felt like they had a choice at that time. And not everybody's immigrants because there were already people here. And that was the Native Americans, the indigenous people. And slaves were not immigrants. They were not voluntarily brought to this country. So we have to be careful of the words we say in the context that they're said in, because sometimes when I look at the full report or the full conversation, I realize that, one thing was taken out of context and it created this whole disconnect and it stirred the pot once again. So what I will encourage you as we go through the next several weeks, because there's going to be more stuff that pops up. I wish I could tell you, hey, we've seen the worst of it and I think we've turned the corner. I don't think we've turned the corner. I think it's just brought many of the things that were hidden that many African Americans as well as Native Americans could have told you. This is the problem that no one really wanted to listen to until we got to this point that we're now in this situation that it's like every week. Not only are we dealing with some of the environmental issues like the fires in California and the flooding and the snow and the cold, what we're dealing with environmentally, but it's, the force of nature, which, in many regards, we there's nothing we can do about it, but hope that people that we know and people we don't know live through it, and are okay. And so that is stressful. And then we have these ongoing situations where we still have, things that happen with law enforcement that bring some light on that continues to shine the light on why do we have this continuous problem that more people of color are arrested and talked about in the media as opposed to any other group. So what I would encourage you to do, which is what I always try to encourage you to do, is not to be distracted. As we are wrapping up today's One Human Nation show, I do want you to keep in mind that the viewpoints expressed in the preceding program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. So as we get ready for Troy coming up with Sound Limit, I do encourage you, if you want to reach out to me, you can send me an email at mystory@onehumannation.info. If there's another topic that you would like to see us covered on the One Human Nation show as it relates to race and racism in this country, send me an email at onehumannation.wruu@gmail.com. And as always, I will be posting the recording of the show, and there's a couple of different ways that you can connect with it. iTunes, and if you haven't started following me on Facebook and the Facebook page for One Human Nation, that's also a good place because I'll give you several different links in how you can connect with the One Human Nation show. So I encourage you to take care of yourself. I would encourage you to be diligent about continuing on your One Human Nation, your reconciliation and healing journey. I realize that it's not necessarily the easiest thing, but I do believe it is necessary for us to go through this process, no matter how painful, in order for us to become One Human Nation. And Troy's in the house, so I'm going to wrap up and get out of his way so he can start his wonderful segment for Sound Limit. And you guys have a good week and take care of yourself.